Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
I ask the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask for speak up to 20 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we're told this week that on Wednesday we're going to have a vote on the so-called minimum wage, the so-called 40% increase in the minimum wage. This is part of a jobs program by my friends on the Democratic side. Now, it's not a program that's intended to pass anything. That was revealed in a New York Times article by my distinguished friend from New York, Senator Schumer, who may be an architect of this. It's to highlight political differences, which is a fair thing to do in the United States Senate. But lest anyone think that anyone's trying to pass a law here, you shouldn't be confused by that. We have had 3 hearings on the minimum wage in the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, of which I'm the ranking Republican member. We've had time to have those 3 hearings, but the chairman of the committee, the senator from Iowa, has said that we don't have time to consider any amendments to this idea about jobs. And it was reported in a newspaper, one of the Hill newspapers. Somebody said, well, why don't you have time for amendments on the minimum wage? He said, well, there might be embarrassing amendments. I think there probably would be, Mr. President, embarrassing only if you voted against them. So let me talk a little bit about this proposal by my Democratic friends to create jobs by raising the minimum wage. Now, they're on the right issue. The issue is jobs. I mean, we've been home in Maine and Tennessee, around the country. Too many people are having a hard time finding a job. Too many people have been out of work for more than 6 months. We call them long-term unemployed. 10.5 million people out of work, an average of 9 months. That's beyond the time for unemployment compensation on the average. It's hard to find a job. It's hard to create a job. It's especially tough on people in their 40s and their 50s and their 60s. And family incomes are lower than we'd like for them to be. And the critical problem is there are too few jobs, especially for low-wage workers. And then we saw a report this morning that said that too many of the jobs since 2008 have been lower-wage jobs rather than higher-wage jobs. So the issue's right. It's jobs. The American people want it to be easier to find a good-paying job. And the Democratic proposal that we're going to vote on this week as a solution to the jobs problem is a proposal that will eliminate 500,000 jobs. Now, let me say that again, Mr. President, in case anyone thought I misread my page of notes. We're talking about jobs, and the Democratic proposal, this is the big deal this week. We're not going to do anything in the United States Senate this week of any significance on the floor, so far as I know, a few nominations, except have a procedural vote Wednesday on the minimum wage proposal. And the Democratic proposal to make it easier to find a job is to eliminate 500,000 jobs. Now, in case you think I'm making this up, let me quote where I got this piece of information. This is from the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. Now, the Congressional Budget Office is something we set up by law because, we'll make our Republican points and then we'll make our Democratic points, and we may shade it a little bit this way or a little bit that way, and we say to the CBO, we call them, you tell us the truth best as you can tell it. So they're nonpartisan. We don't always like what they say. And this is what they said about the Democratic proposal to create more jobs. Once fully implemented, quote, in the second half of 2016, the $10.10 option to raise the minimum wage would reduce total employment by 500,000 people, or 0.3%. That's according to the Congressional Budget Office. Should we believe the Congressional Budget Office? Well, Senator Heller, distinguished senator from Nevada, asked Janet Yellen, President Obama's recently confirmed head of the Federal Reserve Board, what her thoughts on the CBO study and the impact of raising the minimum wage would be. And this is what she said, and I quote President Obama's new Fed chief. The CBO is as qualified as anyone, said Janet Yellen, to evaluate that literature, and she said, I wouldn't want to argue with their assessment. So there we have the Congressional Budget Office saying it will reduce 500,000 jobs, and the new head of the Federal Reserve Board, appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, saying she wouldn't want to argue with their assessment. Now, we'll be hearing more this week about the number of people whose wages will be raised by the minimum wage. There will be that. But the CBO also reported that $4 out of $5 earned from the increase in the minimum wage will go to workers in families who are above the poverty level. $4 out of $5 will go to workers in families who are above the poverty level. And nearly 1/3 of those families would benefit from the minimum wage already earn more than 3 times the poverty level. Mr. President, this reminds me of Obamacare in this way. According to a recent Washington Post story, only about 1 in 4 people signing up for Obamacare were previously uninsured. About 3/4 of people with Obamacare insurance already had insurance before we went through all the turmoil of the last 3 or 4 years. In the same sort of way, minimum wage is said to benefit low-income Americans, but only 1 in 5 of the dollars from an increase will go to families below the poverty line. And that isn't all. In addition to cutting 500,000 jobs and providing 80% of the benefits to the families above the poverty level, the Democratic jobs proposal imposes one more burden on the only Americans who are capable of solving this problem, and that is the job creators. I ask consent to include in the record following my remarks the testimony of Laurie Palmer of Waterville, Maine, who owns 4 Burger King franchises with approximately 140 employees. I say to the distinguished presiding officer, I had no idea he might be presiding today, but I'm glad to have a Maine story. Ms. Palmer says in her testimony, quote, an increase in the minimum wage will directly and negatively impact my ability, she says, to create new jobs while limiting the benefits available to my current employees. I currently employ 60 people who work an average of 25 hours per week and earn the current minimum wage as defined by Maine law, $7.50 per hour. All but a handful of these people were hired within the last 6 months. Mathematically, an increase in the federal minimum wage would cost me an extra $3,900 per week or $208,000 per year. My net income for last year was approximately $35,100. With an extra $208,000 in expenses, she says, I will very likely be forced to close my business. She also notes 100% of my current staff, starting at the minimum wage, are under the age of 25 years. Mr. President, Republicans believe that if we want to create jobs, there's a better way. We'd like to offer our ideas through the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. But as I mentioned, although we've had time for 3 hearings, although we're able to spend a whole week on this on the floor for 1 procedural vote, we're not allowed to offer amendments in the committee, insofar as I know here, because there might be embarrassing amendments. Well, let's consider what those embarrassing amendments might be. They might be about the Earned Income Tax Credit. Senator Rubio, Florida, the President, Congressman Paul Ryan have all suggested that the Earned Income Tax Credit is a better way to make sure that the lowest earning workers in America have a better wage if we're going to get the government involved in it. Now, of course, if we're going to do that, we're going to have to deal with some problems, including the Internal Revenue Service estimate that 20 or 25% of the payments are improperly made. And we could consider the proposals that rather than giving those earned income tax credits out in a lump sum each year, they might be given out with each paycheck. But the Congressional Budget Office also said something about earned income tax credits. They said 1/3 of low-wage workers would be in families benefiting from the minimum wage increase whose income was more than 3 times the federal poverty level in 2016. By contrast, said CBO, an increase in the earned income tax credit would go almost entirely to low-income families. CBO also noted that the earned income tax credit encourages more people in low-income families to work, a value we should encourage. So if our goal as a country is to provide a minimum wage for working Americans, why is it fair to assess the cost of that goal on just the Americans who create the jobs? Of course, it makes creating the jobs harder, but even more important, why shouldn't every one of us who pay taxes share in the burden of paying a higher working wage to American workers? That's what happens with the earned income tax credit. Or there's another proposal, a bipartisan one. We call it the 30 to 40-hour work week. Senator Collins of Maine is one of the principal sponsors. A senator from Connecticut, I believe, is a Democratic sponsor. It's a bipartisan proposal that would, in effect, be a 33% pay increase for millions of American workers who've already seen their hours cut because of Obamacare. It's a way to prevent, said it another way, to prevent millions more workers from getting a 25% pay cut. The reason all this occurs is because Obamacare changed the definition of full-time work from 40 hours to 30 hours. We'd like to change it back to 40 hours. Obamacare says employers with 50 or more full-time workers must offer government-approved insurance or pay a fine. Full-time's defined as 30 hours or more. That sounds like it was made in France. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce says 74% of their members say the health care law makes it harder for their firms to hire workers. Changing the definition of full-time to 40 hours would make it easier. Senator Collins and Donnelly have introduced the 40 Hours as Full-Time Act. It would change the definition of full-time in the law to 40 hours per week. We could be discussing that this week. We could have brought that up in our committee had we been allowed to. Or the Skills Act. There are 47 separate federal jobs programs for which taxpayers are spending $18 billion. The Government Accountability Office says 44 of those programs are duplicative. The Skills Act, passed by the House, consolidates 35 federal programs and creates a single workforce investment fund. Members of the Senate have been working with members of the House to see if we can agree on a revision of the Workforce Investment Act, and we're making good progress. If we can do a better job spending those dollars across America, that would be a good way to help create more jobs in America, or at least make them easier to obtain. But we don't have time for that in our hearings. We could spend time debating amendments to transform long-term unemployment compensation into job training, but we don't have time for that amendment. Today, Americans have been out of work for an average of 9 months. They don't need more compensation, they need new skills. They need skills that help them get a job. Then ask almost anyone on either side of the aisle, what's the best long-term way to make sure that children of low-income families are prepared for a good job? I know almost every governor I know is focused like a laser on this. That's the chance to go to a better school. Well, I've introduced legislation that would allow states to take their money, say Maine's money or Tennessee's money, from 80 federal programs and turn it into $2,100 scholarships that would follow low-income children to the school they attend. We could create $2,100 scholarships for 1 out of 5 kids in America, 11 million children. And when I say schools they attend, that could include a private school if the state decided that. But this wouldn't be a federal mandate to that effect. The state would make that decision. It would simply make sure that these federal dollars follow the child to the school the child attends. If the state wants it to be public, if the state wants it to be on this corner, that's up to the state. We could offer and discuss that amendment. Why not give elementary and secondary children a ticket to a better school? We give them a ticket to a child care development center. We did that in a bipartisan way last month. We have tickets to college. We call those Pell Grants. Why not help them go to better schools? Then there are other amendments that we think, on our side of the aisle, have more to do with creating jobs than a so-called minimum wage proposal that the Congressional Budget Office says will destroy 500,000 jobs. For example, we could build the Keystone Pipeline, which passed the Senate last year during our budget discussion, 52-37. That would create jobs. We could pass the Trade Promotion Authority. President Obama has asked us to do that, both in Europe and in Asia. We have a chance to negotiate, the president has a chance to negotiate trade agreements that would create more jobs in America as we ship automobiles and soybeans from Tennessee and other places to the rest of the world. But the majority leader of the Senate says, no, that's dead for this year. We could debate a proposal to reform the National Labor Relations Board. I don't like the fact that I think they've become more of an advocate than an umpire, with micro-unions, with ambush elections, with undermining the right to work law. But Democrats could come back and say, well, when the Republicans are in, they're more of an advocate for employers, and maybe there's some truth to that. Let's pass a law saying it would be better to create jobs in America if employers and employees could count on the NLRB to be a fair and unbiased tribunal, an umpire, not an advocate. We could create jobs in America and slow the spread of jobs to Europe from America by repealing the medical device tax. That also passed the Senate last year, 79-20, which means there are lots of Democrats for it, as well as lots of Republicans. So as I say, Mr. President, the only thing embarrassing about voting for these amendments to a jobs bill would be voting against them. On the most important issue facing the country, surely we can do better than this stale, bankrupt idea that's been proposed this week on the floor of the Senate, that according to the office that we're supposed to trust for advice, the Congressional Budget Office, would, number one, destroy 500,000 jobs, number two, concentrate most of the benefits on those above the poverty line, and number three, make it more expensive to create jobs, and number four, tax only some taxpayers for a policy designed to benefit the entire society. This kind of thinking is right in line with Obamacare, Dodd-Frank, and all the other policies that have spread a big, wet blanket of rules and regulations over our free enterprise system and made it harder to create a job and harder to find a job in the United States of America. That's why we have 10.5 million people unemployed in America today for an average of 9 months. It's this constant parade of ideas that increase the big, wet, smothering blanket of rules and regulations over the free enterprise system, and that do nothing to make it easier to create jobs and easier to find a job. There are better ideas, Mr. President. Reform refundable tax credits, benefit all low-income workers. Replace long-term unemployment compensation with job training. Change Obamacare's work week definition from 30 hours to 40 hours to encourage full-time jobs. Use existing federal education dollars to give children of low-income families a $2,100 scholarship to choose a better school. All those would create an environment in which job creators could create more jobs, in which those who want them could find a job more easily. That's what we should be about, instead of pretending that we can pass a law in America and give many people a higher income. We can do that. We can do that. But when we do it, make no mistake about it, we're destroying 500,000 jobs and giving benefits to people above the poverty line instead of below. Mr. President, I thank the chair. I yield the floor.